This is Millie Tullis. I'm currently a student at Utah State University, and this paper is entitled Magical Mormonism and Polygamy, the Logan Peep-Stone Woman in Local and Family Lore. The story of the Peep-Stone brides is recounted by a Preston, Idaho attorney in Austin Alta Fife's landmark study of Mormon folklore, Saints of Sage and Saddle, which was published in 1956. The Fifes published the attorney's version of this story without commentary or analysis, and they did not publish alternate versions of the story. In the attorney's version, Samuel Rose Parkinson, a Mormon pioneer, visits a man with a peepstone, also known as a seer stone, in order to locate his lost mules. In addition to finding his mules, Samuel and his wife Arabella see his other wives in the peepstone. Later, after they see these young women in church, they become his second and third wives. However, the Fifes collected several other versions of this story, and most of these versions do not identify the owner of the peepstone as a man at all. Instead, this character is described as a well-known peepstone woman in Cache Valley, and most frequently she is called the Logan Peep-Stone Woman. And while folklorists, historians, and anthropologists have mentioned the Logan Peep-Stone Woman in their work, such as Ian Barber and D. Michael Quinn, no printed sources have named her as Elvine Peterson, a Danish immigrant who moved to Logan in 1870. I was able to confirm the identity of the Logan Peep-Stone Woman as Elvine Peterson through several archival and family sources, and my thesis at Utah State University will go into more detail about her legacy. While there are several versions of the story about the Peep-Stone brides, this paper will consider two local versions in conversation with one family story. Examined together, these stories illustrate important differences about the way gender, divine revelation, and polygamy are negotiated by different storytellers who seek to trivialize or sanctify their narratives. So I'm going to start with the attorney's story, and I'm going to quote it in full because the exact wording is important, but it's also pretty short and quite interesting. Quote, Brother Samuel Parkinson used to live in Kaysville. One day he lost a team of mules. He combed the whole country over trying to find those mules, but he didn't find hide nor hair of them. So he went to a man who had a peepstone. There were a lot of stories roundabout to the effect that people had found lost animals and all kinds of things by looking in it. The man looked and he saw those mules lying down under a tree about 4 miles away. Then he asked Sam if he wanted to look too. There were only a few people, he explained, that could see anything in the large opaque stone, but he always let them try to satisfy their curiosity. So Sam takes a good look in the peepstone, and there he sees his mules laying under a tree. He looks up and turns to his wife, who had accompanied him, and says, Mama, is there anything you'd like to look in the peepstone and see about? Well, there were a lot of men who were taking plural wives about that time. And so Sam's wife says, yes, look in and see if you can find something out about your other wives, if you are going to have any more. So Sam takes another look, and there he sees two beautiful girls dressed exactly alike and standing arm in arm. He pulled his head away and blushed as red as a beet. So his wife grabs the stone and takes a good look. Do you see anything? Sam ventured. Yes, I can see two beautiful girls a-standing arm in arm. As they rode home, Sam asked, Mama, if you ever see those two girls, will you let me marry them? Yes, she replied, but you will never see them. 5 years passed. Brother Parkinson and his wife had moved to Franklin, Idaho, where he opened a grist mill with Thomas Smart. Sam became the first counselor to the bishop. Once, as he was opening Sunday school, he looked down to the back of the meeting house, and there he saw two girls enter, dressed alike and arm in arm, as he had seen them in the peepstone. The curious thing is that they were Tom Smart's own daughters, girls Brother Parkinson had known for years, but whom he had never associated with his peepstone vision for the reason that he had never before seen them dressed alike. After meeting, Sam spoke to his wife. Who did Tom's girls make you think of today in church? She confessed, they look exactly like the two girls we saw in the peepstone. That is how Tom Smart's daughters became the plural wives of Samuel Parkinson, end quote. In this version of the story, the storyteller made several important choices. First, this account genders the owner of the peepstone as a man. Many other archival versions of the story identify her as the Logan Peep-Stone woman or a Peep-Stone woman working in Cache Valley. Additionally, and perhaps significantly, the man with the peepstone is not described as a peepstone man, but instead is only a man who had a peepstone. Perhaps this grammatical difference rhetorically implies that while the man owned a peepstone, it was not significant to his identity or role in the community. This man was not perceived as a fortune teller or witch, as the Logan Peep-Stone woman sometimes is called. Instead, this story emphasizes the power of the object itself. While only some can see in the stone, the vision is not subjective to any single individual. Samuel, his wife Arabella, and the man see the same vision in it. Therefore, the peepstone itself is the vehicle for revelation. And again, this is in sharp contrast to many narratives about the Logan Peep-Stone woman, which emphasize her unique peepstone power over the stone itself, which doesn't seem to work for anyone else. Secondly, the introduction of the brides comes at the direct suggestion of Samuel's first wife, Arabella. Moreover, Arabella only appears in this story precisely when she is needed to make this kind of suggestion. Arabella first assumes that Samuel does have other wives, quote, "Look in and see if you can find something out about your other wives," end quote, and then hedges that assumption, quote, "if you are going to have any more," end quote. Not only does the story structure imply that the plural wives are a result of Arabella's suggestion, but Samuel himself is clearly uncomfortable with the vision as he blushes at the sight of them. Lastly, the daughters of Tom Smart are not characters in the story so much as they are like motifs or recurring images. Like Arabella, the young women go unnamed in the story, and they're only in reference to a man who is named. They're Tom Smart's daughters. And they're only recognized by the fact that they are beautiful and dressed alike and standing arm in arm. Although they appear as a set in the story, Samuel's second and third wives, Maria Smart and Charlotte Smart, were not twins, and they were not married to Samuel at the same time. Samuel married Charlotte in 1866 when she was 17 years old, and he married her sister Maria 2 years later when she was 16. Samuel was in his mid-30s, and his first wife, Arabella, was over 40. Now we're going to consider a second story, which comes from a 1972 letter from Karma L. Sandberg. This letter is found in the Five Folklore collection at Utah State University. Sandberg wrote a letter to the Fives, responding to the attorney's version of the story they had published in Saints of Sage and Saddle, the story we just read. A descendant of Arabella and Samuel, Sandberg emphasizes that her version of the story came from 3 members of Samuel's first family. Sandberg is aware that there are many versions of the story, and this emphasis on telling, quote, "the story first family style," end quote, suggests that the other 2 families, Maria and Elizabeth lines, may tell the story with other styles. Here's the story, again quoted in full from Sandberg's letter, quote, "The story, first family style. Samuel had lost his 2 mules. After searching for over a week for them in desperation, he told Arabella that he guessed he would have to go and see the Peep-Stone lady before he could find the mules. Arabella remonstrated, saying, 'You know where her power comes from.' Samuel jestingly replied, 'Well, I'll take you with me. You are good enough that nothing will hurt us.' They accordingly went to visit the fortune teller in her wagon on the outskirts of the little town of Franklin. She, after the proper gift of silver, looked into her stone and told Samuel that he would find his donkeys behind a high hill in the center of the valley in a ravine which she described. Samuel recognized the place described. They thanked the woman and rose to go, but she, thinking to get added compensation, told Samuel that he must listen to what she could now see in the Peep-Stone. Curiosity aroused, Samuel gave her an added coin, and the woman said, 'I see a small church, and there is a meeting just letting out. Down the steps come 2 young women dressed alike in white. They are holding hands. Is it possible that these young women are your wives?' Both Arabella and Samuel laughed at this, but as they left the wagon, Arabella, still doubting the fortune teller on all counts and thinking that their money had been wasted, said, 'Well, when you see those 2 girls in white, you can marry them, if and when you ever see them.' When a few Sundays later, the 2 of them saw 2 girls, Smart sisters, in white, coming down the steps as they stood in front of the church talking to neighbors, Arabella was overwhelmed by the coincidence. Samuel had found his mules right where the Peep-Stone lady had said, and now there were 2 girls in white, just as he had said, holding hands and coming down the steps. Though Arabella had known for some time that polygamy was in the offing for all the leaders in the church at that time, she had hoped it would not come to her, but having given her word, she lived by it, and the religion for which she had come thousands of miles across ocean and prairie and mountain, leaving relatives and loved ones in England. Samuel realized that he too must obey all of the Lord's commandments and not just those that he chose to obey. The Smart sisters had lived in the fort and village as long as the Parkinsons. There was a limit on the marriage opportunities for young women within the confines of religious faith and the Mormon population. Samuel was prospering and could afford to keep more than one family. It was his duty to live his religion. From these two sisters, there was an issue of 24 children, making Samuel's family a large patriarchal one. Today, the descendants of this man are over 7,000. End quote. The storyteller describes the Peep-Stone woman not as a part of the Parkinson's Mormon community, but instead positions her as a social outsider, utilizing stereotypical Romani imagery by describing her as a fortune teller who lives in a wagon on the outskirts of town. The term fortune teller is not insignificant here. Sandberg seems anxious throughout the first half of the narrative over the role of the Peep-Stone woman, as well as the source of her powers. Arabella is suspicious of going to the Peep-Stone woman for help and warns Samuel about where her power comes from. Moreover, the Peep-Stone woman is paid for her services and is even depicted as being greedy. These choices that trivialize and otherize the Peep-Stone woman's role in the community seem to clash with the second half of the story, when the storyteller casts the vision as spiritual revelation and emphasizes Samuel and Arabella's religious, economic, and social obligations to enter plural marriage. While the Peep-Stone woman scene took place in a very liminal space in a wagon on the outskirts of town, the confirmation of the vision happens on the very stable and patriarchal church steps. Immediately after the young women appear in the story, this sentence is offered about Arabella, quote, "Though Arabella had known for some time that polygamy was in the offing for all the leaders in the church at that time, she had hoped that it would not come to her, but having given her word, she lived by it, and the religion for which she had come thousands of miles across ocean and prairie and mountain, leaving relatives and loved ones in England." It is significant that this is all one sentence, grammatically forcing an intimate connection between each of the sentence's points. In other words, although the ideas may flow awkwardly together, the sentence structure refuses to separate them out. The ideas connected in Sandberg's long sentence are, first, Arabella's knowledge that polygamy was expected for church leaders; two, her own hesitation; three, the significance of living by her word; four, her religion is intimately connected to her history of suffering, traveling thousands of miles across the plains. The Mormon pioneer identity, as depicted as one who suffered greatly and traveled thousands of miles, leaving behind family and comfort to practice her religion in Zion, is a familiar motif in 20th century narratives about 19th century Mormon pioneers. Rhetorically, Sandberg's sentence insists that these ideas must all be held together, even if the connections between each part of the sentence may not be completely clear. Samuel, quote, "realized that he too must obey all of the Lord's commandments," end quote, and marry the two young women. However, his paragraph also incorporates social and economic motivations and argues that he ought to enter polygamy out of duty to his community and his religion, which were, of course, the same thing. Furthermore, social and economic concerns were also church and religious concerns for early Utah pioneers. Therefore, his paragraph sandwiches these practical social and economic justifications for marrying the young women, limited marriage opportunities and Samuel's wealth, between strong religious language. He must obey all of the Lord's commandments. It was his duty to live his religion. The shift in the second half of the story, from the Peep-Stone woman's wagon to the vision's confirmation on the church steps, confirm that the revelation was true, even though the Peep-Stone woman herself was depicted as only a fortune teller and not an integrated part of their religious and cultural community. Sandberg ends her story on the staggering number of descendants that came from Samuel marrying Maria and Charlotte Smart. Quote, "From these two sisters, there was an issue of 24 children, making Samuel's family a large patriarchal one. Today, the descendants of this man are over 7,000, end quote. The implications of this ending is that the marriages and the revelation were right and justified because of their theological success. The Parkinson family literally grew church membership and also mirrored the eternal goals of Mormon men and women to parent many spirit children. Last but not least comes from another Preston local, Arthur W. Hart, who tells the story in 1946. I will quote his narrative only in part because we're getting pretty familiar with the primary contours of the story by now, so we'll just look at some differences. Hart begins this story by describing it as, quote, a little comical, unquote. His retelling is multi-layered, as Hart points out that he didn't hear Samuel tell the story himself, but a friend who had heard Samuel tell it told it to Hart. And this structure, a story heard from a friend of a friend which is true and vouched for, is often an indicator that a story is akin to a local legend. At this point, Hart's version strives to collapse the distance between his telling and Parkinson's own words by quoting Parkinson directly in the story and even articulating his thoughts. So, beginning the quote. An old gentleman, Parkinson, he lived down there in the days when they had plural marriage. He said one Sunday, I didn't hear him tell the story, but a friend of mine told me and vouched for it. He said that one day he was going to church down there, and he said there was an old lady there that had a peepstone and wanted him to take a look. And he said, I wanted to take it too. I thought, well, I believe I will look into that peepstone today and see if I can find out anything. So I did. I looked into it as carefully as I could. I saw two beautiful little girls coming into church that day, all dressed in blue. And he said, I saw and I went down there and started talking to them. First, I found out that I was to preside in church that day. I asked the two girls if they would marry me. They said they would. So, he says, I got two wives. I had one before. I got two more. End quote. And he says it all turned out exactly like in the picture, just like in the Peep-Stone. Sure enough, in came the girls in blue, and sure enough, I went down and married them, and each of the wives had at least 10 children each. Sorry, that's the end of the quote. So unlike Sandberg's telling above, the Peep-Stone woman in Hart's story seems to be part of the Mormon community. She might be outside of the church itself, or she might have been met on Samuel's way to church. It's not totally clear, but she's certainly not operating on the outskirts of town. Furthermore, there's no mention of payment or career as a fortune teller. It's not even really implied that this is like part of her local identity. Instead, like in the attorney's first story, she is described as an old lady there that had a peepstone. Like the first story, Parkinson only looks in the stone to see his brides at the suggestion of a woman, however. The church setting is emphasized throughout, and at the end, Hart reminisces, quote, in Sunday school, the boys all had stories about the Peep-Stone days, end quote, suggesting that this was told by his friend in church. And it's unclear from this statement whether the story was swapped informally among boys or if it was part of a lesson where members maybe were sharing stories they knew about personal revelation. Like the other stories, this story also emphasizes Samuel's position in the church and community and assumes a link between his position and entering plural marriage. In Hart's telling, Samuel said, quote, I was to preside in church that day. I asked the two girls if they would marry me. This seems to support, end quote, this seems to support Arabella's idea in Sandberg's account that the leaders of the church were obligated to take more than one wife. It also illustrates what Tom Mould discusses in his work on personal revelation narratives, that the community often evaluates whether or not a story is true, largely based on the person's spiritual reputation. Here again, there is the attention to posterity at the end of the story. In Hart's story, Samuel ends his telling by sharing that he had, quote, about 36 children, and they are all around here somewhere. The joke comes in with the word about, as if he isn't totally sure how many children he has at any given time. In conclusion, while the attorney and Hart's versions are examples of a community member telling a local story, the Sandberg letter emphasizes the story as a family one. The story seems to have been well circulated with both audiences into the 20th century, and the function of these stories was to explain why something had occurred. This is clear from the attorney's ending, quote, that is how Tom Smart's daughters became the plural wives of Samuel Parkinson, end quote. While it was a little unusual for a Mormon man to marry two members of the same household, such as a mother and daughter or two sisters, it did, of course, happen. And this might have been a form of polygamy future descendants were even a little less comfortable with. Therefore, this story could serve to justify for the family in the future or community members not only why a man had married a younger woman as a polygamous wife, but also her younger sister. Because the Peep-Stone vision is such a remarkable form of revelation, and Samuel himself seems reluctant to marry the young women at first, a listener might feel that they can trust Samuel did not want to marry the two young women out of desire, but because he was bending to revelation. The emphasis on posterity in Sandberg and Hart's accounts, and in many other versions of the story, comes in the end to seal the Peep-Stone's vision status as divine revelation. Thank you so much for being here and hearing this paper. If you have any Peep-Stone stories, I would love to hear them. And thank you again for Ben and everyone for organizing and letting me be a part of this event.